Yes. Hi, and welcome to our ACLU event. My name is Arlene Papa, and I'm the current chair of the Monterey County chapter of the ACLU. I would like to recognize all of the elected officials here in the room. I think that is only Dave Pacheco, Monterey City Council. Is anybody else running for office currently in the room? I don't know. Wes, White? No?
Nope.
Okay.
Not anymore.
He's a no.
Okay, so we have a lovely speaker today from our Northern California chapter of the ACLU. But I would like to announce a few other events that we have coming soon. On Thursday, September 27th, there's a suicide prevention workshop in Salinas from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. I recently had a cousin in Minnesota commit suicide, and I think it was because of the tariffs. She and her husband were farmers, and she had gotten pregnant, and she's Catholic, and so that seemed like the best option. We have a Stop Racism, Whites for Racial Equity event Saturday, September 22nd. And I have a flyer here, and there were many rejoice at the front table.
That's my birthday.
It's your birthday.
If anyone is curious.
Yeah, awesome. Happy to celebrate Ashley's birthday. On October 20th, we will be honoring Blanca Zarazua, who is an immigration attorney, at our annual Atkinson event. It will be held at the Irvine Auditorium in Monterey at 6 p.m. 6 p.m. We made it the time for quite a while. We will have some light snacks and refreshments. It's free and open to the public. We want to respect her work and that of many other immigration attorneys around the country.
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
And the speaker introducing Blanca Zarazua will be Leon Panetta.
Oh, wow.
The speaker introducing Blanca will be Leon Panetta, who's a friend of hers and of her parents.
What was that date again?
October 20th at the Irvine Auditorium in Monterey. It's part of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, right in downtown Monterey.
May I make an announcement?
Yes, you may.
Well, I'm sorry to bring a flyer on.
You want to be on record, you have to speak into this, I'm sorry.
Okay, it's all right. On Saturday this week at 2 o'clock, there'll be a panel discussion at the Village Project on suicide in the African American community. So it's a community event. It's open to the public and free. And it'll be at the Village Project, which is 1069 Broadway. Mel Mason, Lynn Dixon, and I will form the panel, and we're hoping the room will fill up.
All right, thank you. And then I'd like to call up Mary Kate Norsing for a moment. She's the nominating chair for our chapter.
Thank you, Arlene. Yes, my name is Mary Kay Norsing, and I'm the nominating chair for new members, and actually for current members, for 2019, nominating for members on the ACLU Monterey County Board. Nominations are accepted beginning now and really through, well, best if you could get by mid-December. The nominations are filtered through the Northern California office, but I'm the contact person, so I would encourage you either to talk to me afterwards, and I can give you a little bit of information on how to go through the process, or just go to the ACLU Northern California website. Maybe you can work your way through that. We really encourage you to think about joining the board. We're a rather small board at the moment. We would love to become more robust. We need robust at this point in time, as you all know. So, and don't think that any of you are not qualified. If you're interested in social justice, you're qualified. So please think of joining. Well, my email, if you'd like to email me, and if you can remember it, is mknorseng, that's Norseng, @gmail.com.
All right, thank you, Mary Kay. All right, and now I'd like to introduce Mickey Welsh, who will be introducing our speaker.
you all for your patience with all those announcements of wonderful programs that are coming up. I'm happy that you're all here. It's good to see you, and it's good to know that you're concerned about voting as I am, and as Ashley is as well. So I am very happy that we have Ashley Morris here today. Ashley is the organizing director of the ACLU of Northern California. So that means she is in charge of the organizing program in its entirety. That includes the volunteers, the leadership training, community activists and engagement program of the ACLU of Northern California. And doing this, she develops the strategies to involve grassroots organizations and grassroots activists in the ACLU in ways that really the ACLU has never done before. She also assists us, the volunteers, getting involved in legislative campaigns and policy advocacy. Previously, Ashley's been with the ACLU for
11 years.
11 years. By her youth, that means she has been there for a lot of her career. And she's done so much for the ACLU of Northern California and the ACLU as a whole. And her past work included a lot of legislative action and legislative activity and work on or against various propositions that we all care about. So without further ado, and again, thank you for your patience in getting started with the sun shining in brightly. Ashley Morris, the organizing director for the ACLU of Northern California. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you. And some people in this room have been involved in the ACLU for longer than I have.
Yes, some have. So, Ashley, what I'd like to do is start out asking you, what's Congress up to? What is Congress doing? And then why do we have so much at stake in this election?
Is this an appropriate distance? So thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I was lamenting that I can't spend more time down here and make an evening and a day of it tomorrow. I love coming down here. Unfortunately, I have a meeting at 9 to be back in the office for. But I always love coming down to Monterey. Before I answer the question, I also just want to second that the chapter is a great way to get involved with the work of the ACLU, to get more connected with other organizations in the community. You don't have to have any experience to be involved in the chapter. We do a lot of trainings, webinars, and other programming for chapter board members. In January or February, we'll do an orientation that staff will do where chapter board members in different places can come together, get to know each other, learn more about the ACLU, learn more about what a chapter does. So definitely talk to chapter board members who are in the room, who maybe could raise their hands right now, if you're interested in getting more involved. Or if you want to sign in on the sign-in sheet over there, I'm sure they'd be happy to email you a follow-up email with details about how to get more involved with the chapter. So what is Congress up to? What's at stake in this election? I think the best way to describe what Congress has been up to the last 2 years since the 2016 election is by listing their failures, unfortunately. But don't worry, I'll give you a hopeful message later. But Congress has failed to provide a pathway to citizenship for undocumented people who are in this country. This has been something that we hear broad public support for. Voters across the political spectrum, across the country, have demanded that Congress take action to do comprehensive immigration reform in a way that provides protections for dreamers, young people who were brought to the country very young, who have grown up here and gone to school here and gone to college here. Congress has failed to do comprehensive immigration reform in a way that would ensure that we're not further militarizing the border, making communities at the border feel less safe because of the constant police presence and racial profiling that are happening at the border. So we'll add that to the very top of the list of failures of Congress in the last 2 years, and prior to that as well. Congress hasn't passed a Clean Dream Act, again, that would protect young dreamers who want to work, who previously may have had work authorization through DACA and may lose that. I think there's I think the courts have put a stop on the actual end of the DACA program, but who knows what's going to happen in the next 2 years if there's not a shift in Congress. Congress has failed to fully remedy family separation. So family separation happens, the government promised and the courts ordered that the government reunite families, but we know that there are still young children under the age of 5. We're like 42 days or something past the deadline that the courts gave for families to be reunited. They still haven't been. Congress also failed to protect net neutrality. So that's an issue that the ACLU has been working on for a number of years, and an issue that impacts, we know, disproportionately people of color and low-income people, and that's something that will be at stake in the next 2 years as well. And the president has issued new guidance to Health and Human Services that now allows employers and universities to deny contraceptive care to their employees and to their students in their insurance programs simply because they have a religious obligation or religious objection to contraceptive care. So now people don't have access to birth control in the same way that they did prior to this administration and this Congress. So in the next couple of years, the next Congress could pass a DREAM Act. They could end mandatory minimums. We still have mandatory minimums for a number of offenses on the federal level, so people are still being sent to prison for certain drug crimes and other offenses that shouldn't automatically lead to a life sentence. We know who's disproportionately impacted by these sorts of policies. It's people of color, it's largely African American men, it's low-income people. Congress can restore the Voting Rights Act. That's something that would be at stake in the next 2 years or the next 4 years or the next 6 years, probably under a new president. But the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, we will see has already begun to have and will have dramatic impacts on who is voting and whose voices are heard in democracy for years to come, which then will impact who is elected to Congress, which then will impact who is confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, and will end up being a vicious cycle that undermines civil liberties for years and years to come. So it's absolutely critical that we do whatever we can to make sure that we're reinstating important policies like the Voting Rights Act as quickly as possible. And in the next years, Congress could pass the Each Woman Act. That's a law that would finally repeal the Hyde Amendment. Are folks familiar with that? That's a policy that's been on the books since the 70s that says that no federal funding can go toward abortion, period. So anyone receiving federal health care benefits can't use that money for abortion care. Luckily in California, because California has been so progressive on these issues, Medi-Cal does cover abortion, but that comes from state funds. So anyone who is in the military and receiving health care through the government that way can't access abortion or can't access abortion covered by their health care. They have to pay for it out of pocket. So this is an important thing that is a multi-year movement that we're finally seeing traction on and seeing a lot of leadership being exhibited by certain members of Congress, and it's important that we continue the momentum. A lot of this momentum was gained through a lot of the work that was done around passing the Affordable Care Act and ensuring that contraceptive coverage was included in the Affordable Care Act. People are starting to think more and more about the importance of the federal government supporting access to reproductive health care broadly, including contraceptive care and abortion. So these are all things that Congress has failed to do or protect in the last 2 years and has the opportunity to take action on in the coming 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 years.
Which of course makes voting very important.
Yes.
You know, it is not just the courts that can be relied on to enforce these important constitutional rights. If we don't elect people that respect them, then we're constantly having to fight for them in the courts with mixed results or with different constitutional analyses that make victory less likely. So one of the things I want Ashley to address here is, since the ACLU doesn't endorse or oppose candidates, and we're saying how important these elections are. What is the role of the ACLU and even some of the other tax-exempt organizations that care deeply about this issue? What role is there for organizations that don't endorse candidates in a time of an election?
There one for me. Yeah, so the ACLU doesn't endorse or oppose candidates for office, and this is a principle that we're committed to because we find it to be a way to increase our reputation, I guess, in the halls of Congress and in state legislatures, and our ability to hold members of the legislature accountable regardless of which party they are. So we're strictly nonpartisan. We don't endorse or oppose candidates for elected or appointed office. However, there are many things that we can do to weigh in on who's running for office and ensure that people understand the full scope of A, what's at stake in the elections, and B, what power their particular member of Congress or other elected official has to impact those issues, and C, where those candidates for office stand on the issues that they care about. So I'll back up a little bit and just say that after the 2016 election, and then even more after the first Muslim ban was issued in early 2017, the ACLU saw a massive influx of support from people all throughout the country giving small $5 to massive multi-million-dollar donations to the organization. And a lot of those donations came into our 501c4 organization, which is the organization that can spend its money and its resources on lobbying and political activity. And that told us that people really were turning to us and wanting us to do something and take some action and take that action immediately because they didn't like what they were seeing. They didn't like Congress's failure to protect people from the president's executive orders. They didn't like the actions the president was taking, and they wanted us to do something about it. So our resources in that bucket of money where we can use to do political activity have grown dramatically. So it's really important to us that we're using those resources the way that we think people intended for us to use them, and that is to take action now in a way that's sustainable, of course. Don't worry, we're not going to blow it all this year, but we don't think that people were giving that money to us to hold on to for 20 years from now. People wanted us to do something to address what's happening. So that led us to understand that we should be doing something to weigh in the congressional races this year. So what we're committing to not doing is not endorsing candidates, not telling anyone whom they should or should not vote for, not coordinate with any partisan organizations or political parties. But what we will do is educate voters about the issues and encourage people to vote and make sure that we're doing whatever we can to reduce barriers to voting. What that's going to look like, for us at least in Northern California, is a focus primarily on the Central Valley, but with opportunities for people from all across the region to get involved. Who's spent any time in the Central Valley? Like Fresno, Bakersfield, Kern County, Tulare County. So this is an area that is quite different from coastal parts of California. There's very high poverty rates in the Central Valley, low levels of educational attainment in the Central Valley. It's a region that feeds the whole country, literally. The farms in the Central Valley distribute food all around the country. There are about 7 million people in the region that we consider the Central Valley. And we know from polling and conversations that we have with people out in the field that people really care about issues like immigration, gender equity, and access to health care and reproductive health care in particular. We also don't have a strong ACLU base in that area. I don't know how many members you have in Monterey County. Do you have any idea now?
I think the latest count was over 1,000.
Was that like a year ago? Yeah, probably. So I would venture to guess that it's at least quadrupled by then. In 3 congressional districts that we'll be focused on in the Central Valley, which cover multiple counties, big counties, we have about 2,000 total members. But one thing that I'll say that's really interesting about those districts, and those districts that I'm talking about are congressional districts 10, 21, and 22. 10 is represented by Congressman Jeff Denham. 21 is represented by Congressman David Valadao, and 22 is represented by Congressman Devin Nunes. have probably heard about in the news. So of those districts, the most Republican of the districts, there's something called the Cook Political Index that ranks how Republican or how Democratic districts are. So the most Republican of those districts is 22, Devin Nunes' district. That is the district that has the most ACLU members. So that was another thing that when we were deciding how to move forward with the most ACLU members of those Central Valley districts. So in deciding how to move forward with this work for this fall, that told me that people were really in that district were saying, I want to stand up against Devin Nunes, and the way I want to do that is through the ACLU. So in the Central Valley, we're launching a pretty robust field program where we'll have canvassers going door to door talking to voters who have not voted in a midterm election in recent history, who may be feeling disenchanted, who don't feel like things are going in the right direction, and who care about the same issues that we care about, and talking to them about why it's so important that they vote. Again, we're not going to tell them who to vote for. We're just going to tell them, we know that you're registered to vote. It's really important that you turn out. Here's some of the things that are at stake in this election, and here's where your member of Congress, here's how they voted on the issues that you care about. We're also going to be mobilizing people from all throughout the region, including here, if you're so inclined, to phone bank and text bank voters in these key districts so that we're increasing voter turnout. We're making sure that people who aren't typically contacted by political campaigns, like all of you, if you've been registered to vote and you turn out to vote all the time, you get like stacks and stacks of political mail, I would venture to guess, every year. People who don't turn out to vote, like that's all recorded, that's all public record. If you're not turning out to vote, campaigns aren't spending their money to send you mail to persuade you to vote for their candidate. So a lot of these people aren't getting any contact from political campaigns, they're not getting a lot of contact from other community-based organizations. So for us, it's really important that they hear, like, the ACLU cares that you vote. The ACLU wants you to make your voice heard. We want to make sure that you're not facing any barriers to doing that. We want to make sure that you have the resources you need to get to the polls and to vote your values.
Let me just say here, because I looked it up myself and I was pretty impressed. If you go to www.aclu.org/voter, you get to ACLU voter, and if you follow it, you get to put in your address, and it will tell you how your elected officials have voted. And so anybody can go on the ACLU website and get this information. And so it doesn't say so-and-so is a good guy or a bad guy, or a good legislator or a bad legislator. It just says, here's how they voted. And if these are issues you care about, you need to know this. So that's one of the things that the ACLU has done that I think is going to be very valuable for voters all over the country, because this is a national ACLU project. So there is a lot that organizations that are still tax exempt can do. What about voter turnout? The turnout in the last June primary was 37%, which sounds pretty dismal when you're thinking, of the registered voters, not the population. But still, that was the highest since the presidential election in 1998. So what do you attribute the increase to? And then also, what is it that depresses this voter turnout that we can try to address?
I think the increase in turnout is attributable to several things. One is there's a lot of energy around the elections right now. There's a lot of energy around congressional elections, and that was a congressional primary. There are a lot of people who are joining ACLU, Indivisible, whatever organization is in their community, and getting involved for the first time now, and more and more people keep getting involved. I think I was a little worried immediately after the election and immediately after the Muslim ban that people were going to lose energy quickly. And I'm sure there's some people who were involved then who have trickled off now, but I'm seeing a pretty sustained and even growing level of energy around holding Congress and the administration accountable. So that's part of it. And then I think the other part is that a lot of organizations have seen an influx of support and have also seen this increased level of enthusiasm and have been taking to the streets and contacting their membership list to encourage them to turn out and get involved. We did a lot of work around the district attorney elections this year as the ACLU in California, and the ACLU nationally is doing a lot more work around prosecutor elections and prosecutorial accountability. So we focused on several counties where there were contested district attorney races for the first time ever, and told people what kind of power the district attorney had, because a lot of people have absolutely no idea. I didn't until I started doing this work. And we let them know that that race was on the ballot and they should get informed about where their district attorney candidates stood on the issues, and they might be very surprised about what kind of power those elected officials had and where their candidates stood, and they should turn out to vote. So I think there's a mix of factors that contributed to this increase in turnout in June. But California turnout does remain low. I think our turnout is like our turnout in the presidential election in 2016 was like 36th or something in the country. I don't remember exactly, but like pretty low. Our voter registration, I think, is like 49th or something. Don't quote me on those exact numbers, but it's like very low, not impressive. California has made a lot of proactive reforms to increase voter participation, increase registration and turnout rates, but underrepresented communities still tend to be underrepresented by those reforms and not fully supported by the policies that are put in place. So some of the recent reforms that have been good are permanent vote-by-mail voting. So that's great if you can't show up at your polling place because of your work schedule or your child care schedule or whatever. Online voter registration, and then we also have a lot of programs in place for people to register to vote when they're applying for public assistance programs. There have been a lot of problems with a lot of these programs. One, for example, is that when online voter registration launched, it was available only in English. We have a lot of limited English proficiency citizens in California who need to be able to register to vote in their language that they speak well. The DMV was not providing adequate voter registration services for people with disabilities, and a number of public assistance agencies were providing voter registration services but weren't doing it, again, in a range of languages so that everyone could access them. And something that a lot of people I think don't realize is that counties largely run their own elections programs. So you have your elections official here in Monterey County, and they're kind of in charge of how elections are run in Monterey. You have your own voter registration forms, you have your own way of training people who work at the precincts. All these sorts of things are managed by the county. So one of the reforms that I'll highlight that's a great reform but was not really taken advantage of in June is same-day voter registration. And I'll refer to it as SDR because it's a little shorter and easier to say. So 1 in 5 eligible voters in California is not registered to vote. It's 20% of eligible voters, which is, like, to me, pretty shocking. That equates to 5.5 million people. So there's still a massive, people were sort of laughing, like, why do we have voter registration forms here? It's an ACLU event. Of course, everyone at the ACLU event is registered to vote. But that's not necessarily true. People may have, you may move and your registration is no longer valid. Or you may just have never, you might be an ACLU member, you might be on the ACLU membership list, but for some reason you've never registered to vote. I'm gonna guess that not every single one of those 5.5 million people wouldn't be a person that would be sitting in this room today. So if you're talking to friends and family, don't just assume that they're already registered. Have them go online. Usually you can go to your registrar's website for your county and you can look up your voter registration and make sure that it's actually valid. Also, sometimes people get purged from voter rolls. We're hearing about issues happening in counties, even in California, where people are kind of falling off the rolls and we don't really know why. And that's something that we, of course, want to get to the bottom of, but until we get to the bottom of it, it's important that people are checking to make sure their registration is valid and registering. So back to same-day registration. 2018 was the first year for same-day voter registration in California. I think the law was passed in 2016. Technically, it went into effect 2017, but we didn't have elections in 2017. So what same-day registration allows for is for you to register and vote 14 days before Election Day or on Election Day. So it gives you a 15-day window to register and vote. This is important for a number of reasons. it eliminates this like arbitrary voter registration deadline that's usually about a month before an election, right at the point when people start getting engaged in the election and interested in voting. I remember going to the polls in 2008. That's when Barack Obama got elected the first time, right? That was so long ago. I remember standing in line to vote that morning and someone being in line and not seeing her name on the list. They had the precinct list posted outside the door. She didn't see her name on the list and she was like, did I have to do something to sign up in advance? And that was heartbreaking because this woman wanted to show up to vote for Barack Obama for president. She was young, she had never voted before, and she didn't know that she had to sign up in advance to vote. Do you have a question?
I do. I don't know if you heard on the news a lot, but this lady had been in prison and she got out of prison. And she voted and they rearrested her.
Or
voting fraud.
For
voting fraud.
Was that, what state was that in?
It was on the news, I don't know what day it was, but it was on the news that she had been to prison. She got out of prison, then she voted, and then she was rearrested for voting because she was a felon.
I remember, yeah.
You remember hearing that?
Yes, ma'am, I did. Yes, ma'am. It's something I don't recall the state either.
That's
a trailer to that.
Terrible. I mean, there's a lot of work, I wasn't even going to talk about this, but there's a lot of work happening in a lot of states to repeal these bans on voting for people who have been convicted of felonies, because in some states where there are high rates of felony convictions, who's usually being convicted of those felonies, and those people are being banned from voting for the rest of their lives. No matter, they've done all of their rehabilitation, supposedly they're rehabilitated back in society, but we're still saying, but the one thing that you can't still do is exercise your constitutional right to vote.
That's why I think that person has a good claim under the Constitution, so let's hope her lawyer will bring it.
Yeah.
Can I add something about that, because I heard about it on Democracy Now! She had actually didn't see her name there, couldn't register, and so she was walking away, and the poll worker said, no, let's do a provisional, and that's what so she went ahead and voted, and then they still arrested her.
Bad things are happening. People are not being able to vote. People trying to exercise their obligation, their civic duty to vote, are being arrested. It's like a thing that's just not okay.
There was a pundit, I'm sorry, there was a pundit that said yesterday, and I could not get fast enough to find out who it was that said it, but actually said that it's a misnomer to believe that it's a constitutional right to vote. We don't have that constitutional right to vote. So I'm really curious what that was about.
Reynolds versus Sims. One person, one vote.
But California
This is the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld the right to vote time and again. What's happening now are these suppression measures and these interference with people's right to vote, official interference with people's right to vote, which I consider all to be unconstitutional. These cases haven't come to the court yet, but the importance of the Supreme Court is another program we can have in the future, because that is where these cases will end up, probably including the person you're speaking about.
But who confirms Supreme Court justices? The Senate. How do senators get their seats? They get elected. So it's all related, and that's why everyone needs to be voting. Okay, so same-day registration has been shown. Okay, so why it's important? It eliminates this arbitrary voter registration deadline that occurs right when people are starting to get engaged with the election and motivated to get involved. It is important because it allows people to update their records or to re-register to vote if they've moved super recently or super closely to an election. So if you are low income and impacted by incredibly high rents in your community and you end up having to move when you weren't really planning to and it's a month before an election, you're out of luck if you can't just go register and vote on the spot, because once you move, your registration is no longer valid, or if you don't live in the same county where you are registered to vote, then you can't vote because you're not registered. So this impacts primarily people who are younger, who are more mobile in their living situation. Often this is low-income people or poor people. Research has shown that people of color use same-day registration at higher rates than white people. And So there are 15 states that have same-day registration right now, and the average voter turnout in those states is 10 points higher than the average voter turnout in states without same-day registration. Now, can you necessarily attribute all of that to same-day registration? No. A state that has same-day registration is probably doing other things to help eliminate barriers to the ballot box. So it's probably a whole host of policies that are contributing to this, but this is just to say that states that have pro-voter policies that encourage people to vote and encourage people to access the ballot when they haven't done that before are states where we see higher turnout rates and higher registration rates. So the thing about this though is that counties are responsible for deciding how to implement same-day registration. And counties only have to allow for same-day registration at the county elections office. Now, sometimes the county elections office is in a place, it's a small county, and it's a place where a lot of people have access to, and it's close to everyone. That's not the case in the vast majority of places. So my understanding is that currently Monterey County is only providing for same-day registration at the county elections office. That's what my colleague who works on voting rights told me. We saw that a lot of counties in the primary only provided for same-day registration at the county elections office. So this is a really good opportunity for advocacy that all of you can be doing. You can contact your elections officials and tell them, we really think it's important that you have a same-day voter registration location at, maybe by CSU Monterey Bay, because students are mobile and they may not be registered to vote up here, they may not get an absentee ballot from their address where they grew up, so, and it may not occur to them to go register to vote by mid-October. Or it's really important that a registration location is provided in Salinas near some transit hub or whatever. Like, so places where people are frequently coming through, where there's access by public transportation, that's where it's important to have these locations. The pushback that you'll get from the county is that it's expensive to maintain these sites, they have to train staff to work at them, but I think if you tell them the statistics about voter registration, then it's clear that really the right thing to do is to make sure that they're expanding these same-day registration sites. The one other thing I'll just mention is language access, which is another common barrier to people being able to vote. We have 2.5 million limited English voters in California. So these are people who are actually registered to vote, who have limited English proficiency. The Secretary of State has to determine which precincts have at least 3% of their voting age population with a specific language need. And there's a chart online that shows which precincts in which counties have particular language needs. And then the county is supposed to provide ballots and voting materials in those languages for those people in that precinct. Mickey raised an issue to me when we were talking, and hopefully I characterized that accurately, that even isn't sufficient if the speakers of a certain language are spread out across the county, and more than 3% of the county might be, or close to 3% of the county might be people who have that language need, but if they're not concentrated in a certain precinct, they still may not get access as a result of this.
Or vice versa. If they count it countywide and all of them are in a certain precinct or a couple of precincts, then countywide, they don't qualify for the ballot in their language, even though it's a majority language in a certain precinct.
Yeah.
So it's not operating entirely fairly. It should be either or.
But still, it's good that California is attempting to provide some guidance to counties on what kind of languages to provide. But something that you can, again, do to help ensure that people are receiving voting materials in their proficient language is participate in a language access advisory committee. So these committees are something that the Secretary of State recommends that each county have, but doesn't require. And these are committees that work with the community to determine what the language access needs are. They might aid with things like translation. So there are a lot of, I was given an example in the primary where there are certain words that people who speak Spanish as their first language or their primary language in, say, California might translate differently or might use a different Spanish word than someone in Texas who is also speaking Spanish. And so these language access advisory committees can really communicate with the communities who need the language access services and make sure that all of the language access materials that are being provided, what the county is spending money on, are actually useful for the people who need them.
So even though California is far ahead of most other states, the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of State regarding voting rights. What was that about?
So our staff and an organization called Disability Rights California had been working for a couple of years to try to rectify this through advocacy. And eventually in June, we had enough. So we sent a demand letter to Secretary of State Alex Padilla saying, you really need to deal with this, and if you don't do it immediately, we're going to file a lawsuit. So ACLU and Disability Rights California did just file this lawsuit, so nothing has happened yet, but hopefully this will help. So the reason for the lawsuit is that the Secretary of State's office has failed to provide adequate voter registration services to low-income people and people with disabilities. So I mentioned earlier that public service agencies are required to provide voter registration services, but the Secretary of State had failed to designate a number of these agencies as voter registration agencies. And this is required by both California Elections Code and the the NVRA. So the NVRA data shows that we have deficiencies in a number of areas in California. Local education agencies, special education offices are not providing voter registration services. Local area agencies on aging, which often serve older people, obviously, are not providing voter registration services. The California Department of Education's nutrition program, not providing adequate services. And California Student Aid Commission's financial aid offices are also not providing voter registration services because they haven't been designated as voter registration agencies by the Secretary of State's office, which is a necessary step. So don't go to your Monterey County Office of Education and yell at them. Not their fault. It's the Secretary of State's office that needs to give them what they need to be able to provide voter registration services at that space. And this is important because a lot of people who are accessing these services aren't going to be able to, or don't have driver's licenses, and aren't going to be able to access voter registration through the DMV like most other people are able to through motor voter. So Raul, our voting rights manager, asked me to share that with you.
That would be something most of us don't even think about. That the designation of these agencies could have such a tremendous effect on the registration and even the idea of registering for a vast number of people. So if there's more we can do to get our legislators to pressure the Secretary of State to get that list done without having to fight it in court, that would be best. So we're coming to a conclusion here because we want to spend some time on questions and answers if you have them. But what can people do? You've mentioned a lot of things people can do. Is there anything more that people can do? We have the NAACP here co-sponsoring. We have Whites for Racial Equity. So we have the National Coalition Building Institute. So we have all kinds of people with good intentions and members that might be able to actually do something concrete this election.
I believe September is National Voter Registration Month, and I think September 29th is National Voter Registration Day, as designated by whom, I'm not totally sure, but I imagine that there's an active League of Women Voters here, and they probably do voter registration events. I would encourage you all to sign up, go to their website, or contact whoever you know from that organization and see what they're doing in terms of voter registration. Help with voter registration drives on community college and university campuses. These are important things that you can be doing right now to ensure that we're expanding who is actually going to be able to vote. One thing that I want to say about same-day voter registration that I really should have said before, those ballots are still considered provisional. So it's better for people to register in advance prior to the actual voter registration deadline and do everything that way. So don't, if people are like, oh, I want to register to vote, don't say, don't worry, you can wait and do it same day. Get them registered. That's my caveat. But if they're not registered by the deadline, have that other opportunity available. Volunteer with any of the organizations that are co-sponsoring this event. They're probably doing things to talk to voters at farmers markets and other events in the community to ensure that people know what's at stake in this election. Talk to your friends and family members. have those tough conversations at birthday dinners and holiday dinners to make sure that they know why it's so important for them to vote and for them to vote in alignment with civil liberties values. And then if you're interested in doing text banking or phone banking into those really important Central Valley districts that I was talking about, we can work with you to set that up. We'll be having a lot of opportunities for you to do that remotely through our virtual phone banks or text banks. It's not like actually sitting on your phone and texting voters. It's a cool online interface where all the language is pre-populated and you hit enter and no one sees your phone number, so don't worry about that. So that's a great way. Texting is like really the communication means of the future, or the current, I guess. Probably by the next election it'll be done with, but for now, people seem to prefer getting text messages to phone calls. And so we're going to be doing a lot of texting this election. And then go to the ACLU voter website. Again, that's aclu.org/voter. Right? Yes, yeah. aclu.org/voter, or you can just Google ACLU voter and sign up on that webpage, and that will ensure that you're hearing updates from the ACLU chapter about events in your community that are related to the election. And then one other thing I'll mention is that the ACLU has endorsed Proposition 10, which is the repeal of the Costa-Hawkins Act. So that has to do with rent control. So it allows cities to enact broader rent control provisions than are currently allowed.
So tax-exempt organizations are allowed to take positions on initiatives, just not candidates. So you can see what positions the ACLU and other organizations are taking on these initiatives that are coming up on the ballot. The website that we've been referring to, the ACLU Voter, also has many Know Your Rights materials. And it's important to also, I think, for us to educate ourselves so that if people have voting rights questions, if people say, what if I'm not on the list when I go to vote, what do I do? There's a whole Know Your Rights on that, on the ACLU website. You ask for a provisional ballot, you ask, who can I report to if somebody tries to disenfranchise me? If I'm not allowed to vote, who do I tell? That kind of thing is on the website. So I intend to educate myself more as we get closer to the election. I think that's one thing we can all do. And then when our friends, family, people have questions, we can answer them or point them in the right direction. So I want to open it up for some questions that you might have about voting rights, and Ashley might be able to answer them.
Would you repeat the question?
Oh, yes.
I would like to know whether just showing up at one of those agencies that doesn't have voter registration drives, how would you be received? Could you volunteer?
I think the repeat question.
We're going to.
Yeah.
Okay. About the agencies that are currently not doing voter registration, that we want the Secretary of State to designate them. They're not designated. What can we do with them to get them to start doing it voluntarily, even without being designated?
Or can we just show up and say, I will stand here and register?
Yeah, or show up and volunteer to register right then and there. That's it.
I think probably, I don't know this for sure, but I think the issue is that they haven't received this formal designation to like qualify them. So they probably wouldn't allow a volunteer, and I wouldn't expect them to allow a volunteer to stand there and register voters. So I think in the meantime, if there's a farmer's market that's in a lower income community, or if there's a street festival that is, you know, serving a population that might be a little bit more transient, where there's like a lot of rental housing or something like that, those would be good places to maybe reach some of the same population.
You know the ACLU will defend your right to put up a table outside on public property. Any other questions? Janet?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to let people know that Regina Mason, through the Poor People's Campaign, has set up, the Monterey County Elections Department is coming to do a training at the Village Project in voter registration. So if you want to learn how to do voter registration, it's going to be this Thursday, 6 to 7, at the Village Project, 1069 Broadway.
Jan just announced it. This Thursday, 6 to 7, the Village Project on Broadway, will be training in voter registration. So we can certainly all do that and go around registering people. And it's set up by Regina Mason for the NAACP and probably
Poor people.
in the Poor People's Campaign. Correct. Thank you. Helen?
I was asking if I could go to a low income apartment complex that's being financed by the federal government of the state, if they could deny a nonprofit group going in and registering people on their property.
Did they? Did they deny it?
I have been told that Del Monte Manor does not want anybody to come into the building. I think in past years that I have set up a table outside on the concrete, but they would not allow me to have a table inside the multi-use room.
That's an interesting question, because if they own the property, they get to say who gets to be on the property. But if it's a public area that's open to the public generally, then they really don't have the right to deny access to you because you're there to talk about voting rights.
I was thinking that because the Tenants Association had authorized it, that it would that make a difference?
Could you repeat that question?
Oh, the question was that Ms. Rucker wasn't permitted to go onto a private housing, even the community room there, to register voters, and that's even though the Tenants Association had invited her to do that, and whether that was lawful or not. And the answer probably is, it depends. But it may be that to deny you access because of what you're doing, which is exercising your First Amendment right to talk about voting rights and register people, and discriminate against you on that basis, may constitute some violation of law if there's any state agency action involved. So maybe you better check that out.
Yes.
All right. Any other questions?
Yes. I went by the post office because I was told you could get voter registration forms there. I didn't see them anywhere, so I asked, and they said, oh, we're all out. They said, but you can go to the library. So I went to the library, and they had on their shelf 3. So I'm wondering if the county office is really keeping the supplies out there in adequate numbers for people to register to vote. And if not, what do you do about it?
So the question was what to do about having gone to the post office and they're out of voter registration materials, and having gone to the library and there was 3. And is it the registrar of voters in the county that is not keeping these materials adequately supplied to the places where they're supposed to be? That's a good question, and one that we should all call the registrar about. The registrar is accessible. There used to be a group formed by coalitions of these very same organizations that met regularly with the registrar in previous years. So that is something that maybe needs to be reinstituted to get things like that addressed. Oh, I answered that question. Ashley?
No, that's the right answer. Add that to the list with more same-day registration sites.
Yes, so, yeah, and have more sites. At the same time, you can say we need more same-day voter registration sites.
These are elected, registrars usually are elected officials, and a lot of people don't know that, and they're not used to hearing from the public in most counties most of the time. They're not used to being held accountable, and most of them have good intentions. I imagine that they're probably actually strapped for resources. Like, I don't question any of that, but I think it is good for them to hear from the public, and hearing just, unlike a member of Congress who's getting calls all the time from their constituents and from people outside of their region about issues that people want them to vote on or not vote on or whatever, a registrar is not getting calls like that, and so when they hear from just a few people, that's like enough for them to take something seriously and think that there's actually a trend.
Marlene?
So I teach in the CSU, and roughly 20-something% of our students are homeless. I know in like Monterey itself, proper, maybe 0.5% to 3% of people that we can account for are homeless. Can you speak about voting rights for homeless people?
The question is 20%.
Yeah, I think it's 21 or 22% at CSUMB. It's higher in some other CSUs. That includes like couch surfers, like, you know, serial friends you can take advantage of, or your car, or whatever.
So these
Most of the
people,
students,
Some of them living in their cars.
yeah, they live in their cars. I've had a lot of students living in their cars.
homeless people, people living in their cars, or people sleeping on other people's couches.
Students.
How do you reach those
How do you register to vote? Did you have voting rights?
register and?
Students
yeah,
and
what
lecturers.
address should they use? Where are they?
So forms should say address
They can't
or
afford.
nearest intersection, so like there's a way, you wouldn't be able to get, I think you can also put a PO box to get your mail ballot, but you have to
Can you
register.
put general delivery and just pick it up without a PO box?
I'm not sure about the answer to that. Oh yeah, because most people probably don't have a PO box.
You don't have a PO box.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure about the answer to that, but they can still vote in person. And that's why something like same-day voter registration is so important, and so important for it to be available, say, by the CSUMB campus, because if they were previously registered somewhere else or didn't know where to list their voter registration, they can register and vote on the spot at a same-day registration location. But homeless people are eligible to register to vote if they meet other eligibility requirements, and so they can register with whatever address they're currently at. But again, then there will be an issue with them getting their like ballot and voter information. So I don't know the answer about the general deliberation.
Any other questions?
Still a provisional ballot.
Comments?
Comments.
Has the ACLU taken any sort of a stand on voting that is done purely by mail? I believe some of the states are working on that. Does the ACLU have any opinions on that?
The question is, does ACLU have opinions or a policy on voting exclusively by mail?
I think a lot of these things depend on the implementation and the landscape. So there's some really small counties in California that do all their voting by mail. They have a pretty stable population and it works well. But when some states do this, like the issue we were just talking about, if there are homeless people who don't have a mailing address or people who might move within the period between when they register to vote and when the ballot arrives, and after the voter registration deadline, who then aren't able to vote because they don't have any other way to turn in their ballot, then there can be issues. So permanent vote by mail voting is a good way to increase voter turnout because people who request those permanent absentee ballots usually are people with a stable residence who, use that ballot as a way to increase their ability to vote. But there can be issues when states require that everyone only vote by mail.
Okay, we have one more question. Our time is about up. Yes.
I'm not sure if this is relevant or not, but I keep going back to the last presidential election, when millions of people didn't bother to vote. And something I've been suggesting for a long time to folks is that we should have instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting, so we can look for who we want to win instead of yes, we want to lose. I wonder if ACLU and the Green Party and all the third parties get together to push for that. Because we can't vote for who we want to win too often.
So the question is different forms of voting instead of just a simple majority vote for somebody or not vote or vote for somebody else. So what about, ranked voting and things like that are alternatives to our current voting system?
I don't know what the ACLU line is on that actually. In Oakland, we do that. I live in Oakland. We do that for our mayor. I think there's a lot of people see pros and cons to all of these different reforms, and I think California has done things to change our voting system in ways that are intended to at least to be ways that the people who are actually on the ballot in November better reflect the community. So we have top 2 primaries now. Arguments as to whether or not that's actually been the outcome of the top 2 primary system, but I don't actually know what the ACLU position is. But good ideas.
Ruthie?
Which is the safe way to vote, the paper ballot or the machine? Because I've seen machines goof up. So which one you would prefer, paper ballot or the machine?
That is a highly controversial question you just asked there. The question is paper ballots or machine, which is better, which is more reliable, less likely to make errors?
Well, you should always make sure that you get your receipt from the machine and that you have your little tear-off thing from your ballot so that you can go check your, well, at least in Alameda County, I don't know if Monterey does this. I can go check and make sure that my ballot was counted online the next day. There were a lot of issues in 2016 with people whose absentee ballots were rejected because of a signature mismatch.
Yeah.
So there's risk there. I think all of these new technologies are great in some ways and risky in many ways, and it's all in the implementation of any of them.
Give us an idea. When you say you can actually check your but you actually go online and check by virtue of your receipt to say, you just confirm that they've registered, I voted for Hillary, or I voted for, okay. I just wanted to make sure. They're just saying that, yes, this person voted.
Yes.
We don't know how they registered it.
So the question was, can you go online and check how you voted? And the answer to that is no. You can't find out who you voted for, but you can keep your receipt if you have machines. Many precincts in Monterey County have hidden ballots.
We have paper, but we insert them into the thing.
We insert them into a thing and then we punch it.
Even if you use a paper
Very
ballot, the machine will.
Any other questions?
I want to applaud Joyce for being proactive and going to the post office and the not the DMV, the library. And I was just looking on the Monterey County election site. They're also supposed to be in banks and other public offices. But if everyone in this room would regularly, I don't know, every couple days, go check at your post office, check at the library, and if they're not there, call the elections office. I mean, that might. I just think that I'm just looking for little things that each one of us could maybe do that.
Or even a step beyond that, the elections office might be failing to do these things right now, and you can call them to complain and push them to do better, but in the meantime, people need those forms, so you can go down to the elections office, get those forms, and put them in those locations as well.
Oh, can you do that?
I think so, if it's like a location that's already like agreed to have them and they're just out of them, I think if you just show up with them and take them, yeah. I can't imagine a library saying, no, you can't put those in the registration forms.
And I just have to say, Helen Rucker is here, and one of her purposes in life before an election is always to register voters. That's what she does, and you've got it on your computer, and she has expertise in doing that. She could train any one of us probably to do it. So keep Helen in mind, and let's thank her. She does a great job. And I believe, Ruthie,
I know,
one last question.
I worked the polls, and I know at the last election, they was looking for people to work the polls. They were willing to pay them double to get people to work the polls, because a lot of people are not working the polls anymore.
Wow.
That's true, yeah.
So working the polls is another way that you can help with the election process, and you can make sure that whoever comes into your polling place is treated fairly and in compliance with the laws. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
So our time is about up. Ashley, is there anything else?
Exactly is the elections office.
Salinas. I'm not sure of the address.
Showing place now.
Right next to Notting Hill.
No.
No, they moved.
Even you don't know where the elections office is. And you're showing me.
It's way out by the airport.
Yeah, it's on.
Very complicated way to try to get there too.
It's on-
I haven't found my way out there yet.
Schilling Road in Salinas.
Shilling.
That's where it is, and it's the old Schilling plant, which is, used to be
It's
way out in the
out
middle of the fields.
by the airport.
She said no.
Yeah, it's on the west side of the.
Capital One.
Right.
There by
You can see the
Abbott Road.
Capital One.
Household.
Yes, yes, both.
41
Building that the county took over.
Okay, everybody, 1441 Schilling Road.
There you go.
Yeah, if we can jam them.
It's in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
What I wanted to say is that if you come on Thursday and get the training how to do voter registration, they're gonna bring us some registration forms to that event. And if you have not had the training and you go to the registration office and ask for forms, they will give you 1 or up to 49. But if you've had the training, you can get as many as you want.
Oh, good. So she's
I've
pointing
got a
out
whole
that
box.
if you come to the training next Thursday, you
This
can be
Thursday.
trained to be registrar of voters, and then you can get as many forms as you want if you go to the election.
So if you go to your library, as Elaine was suggesting, and there are no forms, and you weren't able to go to the training, you just need to find somebody who's at the training to get forms.
Yeah, you can find somebody who was at the training or a trained registrar, and they can go to those forms. So I guess we can stay and talk about this informally, but it's probably time to close the program and thank Ashley for this excellent presentation.